Hi, I'm Dr. Selena Fisk, and welcome to this episode of Make Data Talk. In this podcast, I help you turn your spreadsheets into stories in a way that is practical, accessible, and hopefully a whole lot more useful than your grade 9 maths textbook. Today, I'm going to be riffing about two different types of analyses that we do when we're looking at data. When we're looking at it, we do one or the other, but not all analyses are created equal. The most important thing is that we need to know how to use both of them and when each one of them is most appropriate. When I started to write my thesis, I did a literature review. So one of the things you have to do is you have to look at all of the existing research in the area that you're investigating. I obviously, I have a teaching background, so my Doctor of Education was in student perceptions of feedback. And so I started to look at the research and the literature on student perceptions and what they thought and kind of what was going on for them in the classroom when it came to feedback. And that was kind of interesting and useful, but what I found pretty quickly was that a lot of the research that existed actually was done from a teacher's perspective, and it was done, I guess, by researchers with not too much student involvement. What it meant for me then was, as I was kind of planning my research and thinking about what I was going to do and how I was going to collect my data, it meant that I couldn't definitively go in with a hypothesis. I had a pretty good idea of what I was going to find, and I knew obviously what I was interested in investigating, but there wasn't actually enough research sitting behind my ideas to really lead with a hypothesis in my research. So what it meant was that I actually ran my thesis without a hypothesis. I went in kind of thinking, okay, there's not enough research, there's a bit of a gap in the literature, and I just want to learn more about this particular phenomenon. And I'm going to write about what I see and what I hear and what young people tell me. During the process of writing my thesis, I was exposed to this idea of an exploratory analysis versus an explanatory analysis, or exploratory and explanatory research. And, the clue's certainly in the name. An exploratory analysis is, as you would expect, it's an exploration. It's where, kind of like my thesis, there is no real hypothesis sitting behind the investigation. It is where somebody explores that phenomenon. Whereas an explanatory analysis is often where there is a hypothesis, where we're going in with an assumption that we're trying to, or with a hypothesis that we're trying to either prove or disprove. And we're seeking data that explains the phenomenon or the thing that we, expect to be happening. Because I didn't have good research that was kind of sitting behind my thesis from a student's perspective, it meant that I actually couldn't undertake an explanatory research project because I couldn't actually formulate a really kind of grounded, research-oriented hypothesis. Everything I was going into the inquiry with was basically based on my hunch as, at that point I'd been teaching for 10 years. So it was a pretty strong hunch, but the research didn't back me up. So instead, I ran this exploratory analysis. The reason why I'm sharing this with you today is because when we think about the analysis that we do with our own data in our role and in our own organizations, we can think about it in one of two ways. We can think about it as if we have a hypothesis and we're interested in a particular area of inquiry. And if that's the case, then we run an explanatory analysis. What we do in that case is we think, okay, what's the particular phenomenon that we're investigating? What are 3 or more possible data sets, because we want to be triangulating, but what are 3 or more data sets that can give me really good information about that particular area of inquiry? And then what is it telling me about my hypothesis? And I'm testing that hypothesis, and I'm thinking, as I'm doing the analysis, is this data proving my hypothesis to be true, or is it disproving my hypothesis? So it's explaining the phenomenon. More often than not, that's the type of inquiry that we do when we look at data in our organisations. We have a particular area of focus. We have a particular board report that we have to write. We have particular KPIs that we're working towards. We might have a particular area of focus or project in our team for that particular quarter or that year. And so we choose those handful of metrics and we are testing out our hypothesis against them and looking to see what the data is indicating. Have we made an improvement? improvement? Have we stayed the same? Are things kind of tracking a little bit backwards, or are things not going as well as what we might have hoped? So that's probably the most common type of analysis that we're doing. It's an explanatory analysis. What we also need to do, though, is we need to factor in opportunities to do an exploratory. So exploratory is where we're not really sure what's going on. Perhaps that's one option. And we are doing a really big dig. And as I said earlier, the clue's kind of in the name. In an exploratory analysis, we are sweeping far and wide. We are doing a really comprehensive analysis of multiple data sets. We're investigating every possible avenue, rabbit hole we can. And obviously this means that this process is quite time consuming because we're not just focusing and looking at a really narrow set of information. We're actually kind of broadly sweeping and considering, have we actually missed anything? Is there anything else out there that we need to pay attention to? We need to be doing this because if we just solely focused on an explanatory analysis of our data all the time, there is a chance that we would potentially miss something that is popping up or emerging as a bit of an issue elsewhere. And I think this for me speaks to that challenge that so many of the people that I work with kind of say, is that they say, I'm happy to do some analysis and look at some data and I want to tell a data story, but what if I have missed something really important that's sitting elsewhere? And how do I know that my particular thing that I'm sharing or focusing on is actually the most important right now? Now, there's a little bit of work that needs to go into the background, obviously, to set up what our explanatory analysis would be, how often that's happening, who's in charge of it. And that's where a data plan potentially can really help us focus on who's using what data and when, to make sure that we do have eyes on the right data at the right times. And we are keeping track of those metrics that we've identified as actually being really important to us in our organization. Exploratory, though, is less structured. So it would be something that potentially happens on a regular or semi-regular cadence, maybe once every 6 months, 12 months. I've worked with organizations that do it every 2 to 3 years when they're writing a new strategic plan and they're trying to identify what their areas of focus should be in the strategic plan moving forward. And they kind of factor in a few days to do a big deep dive into a whole range of data to make sure they haven't missed anything. So that's one option. The other time exploratory analyses come up in our workplaces is when, say, there is a metric or something has happened quite significantly that's kind of rattled you, shaken you, or you want to know more about it, and it's kind of come out of left field, and maybe it wasn't something that you were focusing on, but there's kind of been this major alert and you think, okay, I need to know more about that now. So again, kind of like that strategic planning exploration that some organizations do, sometimes an exploratory analysis actually happens at that point where something is flagged and you're like, actually, we need to spend some time investigating this particular thing and the current situation and all of the factors that are contributing to whatever this metric is that we're kind of not happy with, or whatever we've seen kind of that has alerted us. And then it's a big deep dive. When I've done this as an employee, but then I've done it as a consultant and as a coach as well. As an employee, I actually, in one organization, I was allocated 3 days in a boardroom with 2 other middle managers, and we just did a big exploration, and that was leading into a strategic plan. And then equally as a consultant, I've had that experience where organizations have come to us and said, look, we're really concerned about this particular thing and we don't kind of know where to go forward or where to go from here. And so I've been the external person doing the exploration for them, which, it is what it is. It's having an external person look at your data is can be useful. It can be because they don't understand the context. But equally, you can see things in an exploration that you would have potentially missed in an explanatory analysis. So both absolutely have a time and a place. On a day-to-day basis, in our regular kind of run-of-the-mill, any data work that we're doing in our role, we're doing an explanatory analysis because we know our roles, we know those metrics that matter to us, we know what our data plan says about what we're looking for and how we use that information. But we need to make sure that if there's something that flags that kind of alerts us to something extra, that we do an exploration into that to try and find out what's going on and to consider the different factors. And or we also need to be able to zoom out every couple of years, say pre-strategic planning, to think actually what do we need, what does our organisation need, what do our clients and the people that we serve need, and what's the data telling us across the board about that. And so we can put together that exploratory analysis. And the really cool thing about an exploratory analysis is that so often things come out that you may not have anticipated or expected to begin with. So that's some of my favorite work to do, because you start it and you kind of never know where you're going to end up, which is exciting and a bit scary at the same time. But thank you for joining us again this week on Make Data Talk. I hope that you have found that discussion of the explanation or the exploratory and the explanatory analysis useful. It's something I talk about a lot in my data workshops, and it's something that often resonates and people kind of talk back to me about, like they kind of say, oh, look, I'm doing an explanatory for this, or I'm actually really interested in an exploratory. So I hope that's been useful for you today to think about those two different types. If this has been useful, I'd really appreciate you sharing the podcast with anybody else who you think might find it interesting. As I've mentioned before, this is also available as a newsletter on LinkedIn. It's also called Make Data Talk. And while you're there, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn at Dr. Selena Fisk. As always, thanks for being here, and take care and look after yourself.